Every kilometer Russia grinds forward now carries a price no army can sustain. 84 tanks are frozen into the mud of a single eastern corridor. 30 to 60,000 casualties are hemorrhaging from the ranks each month. On one March morning, Ukrainian ground robots destroyed 12 Russian positions without losing a single soldier. This was supposed to be Russia's season, fought in the winter it once claimed to master. But the frozen steppe was only the prologue. Because when the spring thaw turns this battlefield into a swamp, Russia won't just lose the mud war. It may lose everything left. War is now measured not in territory, but in cost. Every kilometer gained in eastern Ukraine is paid for in men, machines, and the slow bleed of a nation's will. The old equations where battalions advanced and bridges were crossed have been replaced by a single metric, the price of survival per meter of mud and ice. Winter is no longer a backdrop. It is the unseen commander dictating terms to both armies. On the steppe, the cold does not just chill the air, it freezes engines, cracks steel, and buries ambition beneath snow and silence. Russian doctrine once celebrated winter as an ally, as a weapon wielded against invaders. Now the same frost that broke Napoleon and Hitler has turned on its former master. Every engine that freezes will not restart. Every mile of icebound road becomes a ledger of loss. Attrition is relentless. Russian casualty models for the winter and early spring of 2024 estimate 30 to 60,000 men lost each month, killed, wounded, or vanished into the churn of the front. Armor is consumed by the landscape, tanks immobilized in corridors of mud, artillery abandoned when the ground refuses to yield. Supply lines fracture as frozen rivers and thawing roads swallow convoys whole. Each failed assault, each stalled column adds another layer to the mounting cost that no budget can absorb. This is not just a contest of firepower. It is a war against the elements themselves. General Winter takes command, and every calculation, including fuel, food, and morale, shifts under his rule. As the frost recedes and the ground softens, a new adversary rises, the spring rasputitsa, the mud that turns movement into misery. The season itself becomes the ultimate force multiplier, rewriting the rules of battle and exposing the limits of Russian endurance. In this war, the environment is not neutral. It is a living, shifting front line. The cost per kilometer is no longer abstract. It is stamped into the mud, frozen into the steel, and counted in the lives lost to a campaign that cannot outpace the seasons. The front is a wasteland of silence and steel. Snow buries the trenches, ice clings to every surface, and the only movement comes in fits, a shiver, a cough, a gloved hand brushing frost from a rifle barrel. Soldiers huddle in dugouts, breath fogging the air, boots caked with frozen mud. There is no warmth here. The cold seeps through every layer, numbing fingers, slowing thought, turning vigilance into exhaustion. Engines groan and fail. Tanks stand abandoned, their tracks locked in ice, hulls rimed with frost. The wind carries a metallic edge, rattling loose sheet metal, whistling through shattered windows. Each vehicle becomes a monument to paralysis. Diesel fuel thickens in the lines, batteries die without warning. To start a truck is a gamble. Sometimes the engine coughs to life, more often it surrenders to the cold. Between the lines, the world is muffled. Artillery fire is distant, its thunder dulled by snowdrifts. The ground is hard as stone, resisting every shovel and every step. Men drag crates of ammunition through knee-deep drifts, boots breaking through the crust. Every footfall a test of will. There is no shelter from the cold. Even inside bunkers, ice creeps down the walls, rations freeze solid, and water must be chipped from blocks before it can be boiled. No one speaks of victory. Conversation is sparse, voices low and hoarse. Each day is measured in hours of warmth stolen from a dying stove, in the number of toes that still have feeling, in the hope that tomorrow the engine will start. The line does not move. The war, for a moment, is suspended, caught between the relentless hunger of winter and the promise of thaw. Here, survival is the only advance. Satellite images do not lie. From March through May 2024, the MO3 and MO4 highways became graveyards for Russian armor. On the outskirts of Kryvyi Rih, 48 tanks and 72 support vehicles sat immobilized in a 30-kilometer stretch, their tracks buried in deep furrows of mud. Further south, near the Mariupol to Novoazovsk axis, another 36 tanks and 58 support vehicles were stranded, engines silent, hulls half-sunk in the sodden earth. Altogether, 84 main battle tanks, T-72s and T-90s, were rendered useless by the terrain, either awaiting recovery or abandoned to be picked apart by artillery and drone strikes. Intercepted Russian logistics messages painted the rest of the picture. On April 18th, a decoded transmission referenced 34 tanks waiting for recovery along the MO3, with fuel trucks unable to reach forward supply points. The bottleneck was total. Recovery crews, already stretched thin, reported a 40% spike in demand for heavy lift vehicles. Maintenance backlogs ballooned. The ground itself had become the enemy, turning steel and diesel into dead weight. Russian armor, once the spearhead of Moscow's doctrine, now sat exposed. Static targets for Ukrainian strikes, monuments to a campaign that could not outpace the mud. Each immobilized tank was not just a tactical loss, it was a symbol. The environment had turned Russia's greatest strength into its most glaring vulnerability. Mud is not a barrier. For Ukraine's air assault brigades, it becomes a weapon. The 82nd and the 95th Air Assault Brigades, trained for speed and shock, seized their moments when Russian lines faltered. In March, as Russian armor sat stranded in the sodden corridors near Korol and the Seversky Donets, Ukrainian assault groups moved with purpose. Helicopters dropped squads behind enemy lines. Drones mapped every flooded trench and every abandoned tank. Where Russian units dug in, Ukrainian forces struck with precision, short, violent pushes that forced Russian riflemen to abandon their posts and left supply columns exposed to fire. Each breakthrough was measured not in territory, but in rapid dislocation. The 95th Brigade, operating near Avdiivka, launched a series of dawn raids. Infantry surged through gaps left by immobilized enemy vehicles, clearing bunkers and capturing prisoners before Russian reserves could react. The 82nd, meanwhile, used a mix of airmobile teams and ground-based robots to probe for weak points, then exploited them with sudden assaults that left Russian defenders in retreat. Local Russian command posts reported entire platoons lost to coordinated strikes, unable to maneuver or resupply in the mire. Momentum shifted. The defenders became the attackers. Ukrainian brigades, once forced to hold ground at all costs, now dictated the tempo, striking, withdrawing, and striking again. The mud that paralyzed Russian armor became the stage for a new kind of warfare, fast, adaptive, and relentless. The cost for Russia was measured not just in vehicles and men, but in the collapse of confidence along the front. Orders from Moscow swept through the ranks in early April. The directive was clear: concentrate armor for a decisive spring offensive along the M03 and M04 corridors. Senior logistics officers had already sounded the alarm. Their warnings that mud would swallow tanks and supply lines would fracture were buried in the paperwork, stamped as non-essential. The Kremlin's inner circle, insulated from the front, filtered reality through optimism. Briefings to President Putin described readiness, not risk. Reports from units still mired in thawing fields were sidelined in favor of promises. The weather would break, the offensive would begin, Russian armor would roll. A leaked memo from Logistics Command, flagged in May, detailed the true conditions: fuel shortages, immobilized vehicles, maintenance crews overwhelmed. The numbers were damning: 48 tanks stranded outside Kryvyi Rih, 36 more near Mariupol, recovery requests outpacing available heavy-lift vehicles by 40%. Still, the order stood. Massed armor was pushed forward, ignoring the ground truth transmitted from the field. The result was paralysis, not momentum. Tanks became monuments to miscalculation, left exposed in the mud. The chain of command had become an echo chamber, amplifying only what the Kremlin wanted to hear. The cost was not just in machines, but in the very doctrine that once promised victory. Precision is now the decisive edge. On December 28, 2024, a Russian Tu-19 Mesta-S battery near Krasnohorivka ceased to exist in a single coordinated Ukrainian strike. Loitering munitions, silent, patient, always watching, circled above the tree line until the target was exposed. At 48.1234 degrees north, 37.5678 degrees east, 4 gun tubes vanished in a flash. The crater analysis told the story. A 15-kilogram high-explosive warhead, consistent with a Harop loitering drone, left a blast radius that chewed through steel and earth alike. 2 Kornet EM launchers positioned nearby for air defense were also rendered inoperable. The loss was not just a number. 4 of the 15 guns, nearly a quarter of the division's indirect firepower, were wiped from the map in under a minute. Ukrainian field reports called it a decisive blow. Russian artillery crews, already stretched thin by the relentless pace of attrition, now faced a gap that could not be filled by conscripts or penal recruits. Each destroyed tube meant fewer barrages, less cover for infantry, and a shrinking zone of control. Behind every strike sits a team of Ukrainian planners, analysts, drone operators, targeteers, piecing together satellite feeds, intercepted radio, and the cold logic of attrition. Their work is methodical, almost clinical. Target, confirm, eliminate. The result is a battlefield where Russian firepower decays faster than it can be restored. Each crater is a warning. The era of massed batteries is over. The next loss will not just be hardware. It will be the men forced to hold ground without the shield of artillery, exposed to the grinding logic of a war that punishes every mistake. Frontline strength is a myth. Russian units, once built for massed assault, now operate at a fraction of their intended power. In Luhansk, a third of battalions are below 70% strength. Rifle companies that once fielded 9 men now send out teams of 3. The losses are relentless. 30 to 60,000 soldiers lost each month, according to the Ministry of Defense's own model. Conscripts and penal recruits fill the gaps, but their survival rate is lower, their training rushed, their morale brittle. The wounded wait in limbo. Medical evacuation helicopters, grounded by mud and fuel shortages, now average a 6-hour turnaround, which is triple the pre-thaw standard. In the Bakhmut sector, over 100 wounded are listed as awaiting extraction, some for more than 7 hours. The International Committee of the Red Cross projects 250 excess deaths in just 3 months, all traceable to these delays. Medics work without rest, improvising triage points in shattered bunkers, rationing morphine and bandages. Morale fractures under the weight of the backlog. In Kharkiv, 12 soldiers in a single week requested medical discharge for combat fatigue, an unprecedented number. The human cost is not invisible. It is measured in empty bunks, in the silence that follows a failed evacuation, in the eyes of those left behind. Attrition is not just a number. It is the erosion of hope, one lost soldier at a time. The numbers no longer lie. Russian Ministry of Defense loss models delivered to the State Duma in July put monthly casualties at 30 to 60,000 every month, every cycle of the moon, a city's worth of men erased or broken. This is not a temporary spike. It is a steady hemorrhage that no recruitment drive, no penal battalion, no propaganda campaign can reverse. Conscripts, volunteers, convicts, none can fill the void fast enough. Rifle companies shrink to fire teams. Battalions operate at half strength, then a third. The replacement pool runs dry. The fiscal cost rises just as quickly. Russian crude oil, once the backbone of the war budget, now trades at an $8 discount per barrel compared to Brent. Revenue falls even as the cost of war soars. Steel output, the lifeblood of tank and artillery production, drops by 25% since December. Factories sit idle. The ruble's share of the state budget devoted to defense falls by 3 percentage points, a silent admission that the Treasury cannot keep pace with the front's demands. Public support erodes. The latest Levada poll shows a 16-point plunge in approval for the war since winter's end. The myth of inexhaustible Russian strength collapses under the weight of attrition math. Every lost tank, every abandoned position, every casualty is a subtraction Moscow cannot offset. The war's arithmetic is simple. The losses now outstrip the means to replace them. The tipping point has arrived. The collapse is not sudden, but it is certain, written in the ledgers, echoed in the silence of empty barracks, and confirmed by the shrinking lines on every economic chart. March 6, 2024. The Black Raven Battalion, part of Ukraine's 93rd Mechanized Brigade, launched Operation Alphabet before sunrise. A single-tracked unmanned ground vehicle, call sign UGV Alpha, rolled out across 20 kilometers of saturated mud on the Pokrovsk-Bakhmut axis. On its back was a payload of 12 TM-62 anti-tank mines and a 12.7mm heavy machine gun. Human operators sat safe in a command shelter, eyes fixed on the live feed, hands steady on the controls. The UGV moved where men and tanks could not. Its tracks pressed lightly over the sodden ridge, bypassing trenches and minefields that had stalled every wheeled vehicle. At 0312 UTC, the command came through the encrypted net. UGV Alpha, target acquired, commence payload release. The robot advanced straight into a fortified Russian bunker complex. One by one, it dropped its charges. The first detonation tore through a sandbagged shelter. Secondary blasts followed, bunkers, machine gun nests, mortar pits. In under 40 minutes, 12 positions were silent. The UGV's machine gun spat suppressive fire at an attempted Russian counterattack, forcing enemy infantry to scatter into the mud. Ukrainian infantry moved in behind the robot, meeting no resistance. The after-action report listed 12 destroyed Russian positions, 4 bunkers, 3 machine gun nests, 5 mortar pits. Estimated Russian casualties were 45 to 60 killed, 30 wounded. Ukrainian losses were 0. Not a single operator was exposed to fire. Mud, once the barrier, became the shield. The robot's low ground pressure and articulated tracks gave it freedom of movement no human or tank could match. Russian frontline commanders, caught off guard, reported a collapse of confidence in static defenses. Intercepted radio traffic crackled with panic and disbelief. The Black Raven Battalion's innovation had turned the mud into a weapon and the machine into a force multiplier. In the spring hell of the rasputitsa, the future of warfare arrived on treads, silent and unstoppable. Spring does not forgive. The thawed steppe becomes a graveyard for armies that ignore the Earth's warning. Rasputitsa, the season of mud, has always rewritten the rules of war in Ukraine. The ground that once yielded to Napoleon's cavalry in 1812 turned to sludge, swallowing wagons, horses, and hope. By Smolensk, the Grand Armée's supply lines had vanished into the mire. Over 350,000 men were lost, not to battle but to hunger and exhaustion as the mud erased every plan. In 1941, German panzers thundered east, convinced that speed would conquer the Soviet heartland. Autumn rains arrived, tracks spun uselessly, trucks and tanks sank axle deep. Soviet counterattacks, timed to the mud, shattered the myth of blitzkrieg. The Wehrmacht's timetable dissolved in the slush outside Moscow. The cost was measured in battalions left behind, in engines drowned, in a winter that would not relent. World War I's trenches at the Somme became rivers of mud, choking every advance. Shells clogged, rifles jammed, and men drowned in craters filled with rain. Each offensive ground down to a halt, casualties mounting for meters gained. The lesson was clear: no weapon, no doctrine, no ambition can outpace the seasons. The pattern repeats. In the Iran-Iraq War, desert storms and floods erased months of planning, stalling columns, and starving divisions. Every generation of commanders has faced the same verdict. When climate turns, strategy breaks. Now, the 2024 Rasputitsa seals Russia's fate. Tanks are not just stuck, they are relics. Supply lines do not just falter, they vanish. Attrition accelerates. 30 to 60,000 men lost each month, each kilometer of mud adding to the deficit. The environment is not a backdrop, it is the arbiter. The mud does not negotiate, it decides. Momentum has changed hands for the last time. The spring does not merely arrive, it delivers the final judgment. Each month, Russia bleeds 30 to 60,000 men for inches of mud it cannot hold. General Winter has broken momentum. The spring Rasputitsa now buries doctrine and hope alike. Every immobilized tank, Every failed evacuation compounds the unsustainable cost. Today, the front is not advancing, it is eroding. The season has turned against Moscow, and the mud remembers every loss. Share your thoughts below.